It's like beyond all hope. Like tragedy is imminent. You've lost, there's scars, there's blood, there's death. And yet there's like a glimmer of intense, poignant hope and joy that comes through. So Lewis inherited this view of Good Catastrophe, and he felt like the gospel is something that you can't just reduce to either the crucifixion or the resurrection. You have to hold them both together. So there's this shadow of death and defeat and tragedy and shame, but at the same time, there's this motif of reunification and unity and love. The whole reason why Christ came to redeem us is to reunite us with our beloved, which is God, and to introduce a new kind of life.
G'day everyone, Dave Deane here, and I'm excited to share with you a conversation I've just had with a friend and scholar, Dr. Jahdiel Perez, who is joining us from the east coast of the USA. Dr. Perez holds an MA from the University of Massachusetts in Boston, an MDiv from Harvard University, and a DPhil from the University of Oxford in the UK. And he currently serves as an assistant professor in humanities and sciences at Villanova University. I got to know Jahdiel during my time at Oxford when he was the president of the Oxford C.S. Lewis Society and neck deep in his doctoral studies. And it's the fruit of that labour that we're going to be talking about today. Jahdiel is a humble, brilliant, passionate educator. And today we'll be discussing his significant contribution to Lewisian scholarship and the intricate threads of joy and sorrow woven throughout Lewis's life, literature, and theological formulation. So whether you're a seasoned scholar, a casual reader of Lewis' works, or someone just exploring the big questions of life, I think this conversation will be of a benefit to all of us as we navigate our own experiences of joy and sorrow with a synthetic vision that speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human and to hope and seek meaning in a world that is often both beautiful and broken. Well, welcome, Dr. Jahdiel Perez. Mate, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you too. I'm really excited about being with you.
Yeah, and look, I'm just excited that I get to call you doctor because I think it was, 5 years ago that we were there together at Oxford Uni. You were neck deep in your doctoral studies, but a big congratulations to you for making it through.
That means a lot to me. Yeah, I still can't believe it's happened already. I'm just really grateful to God and to friends like you. I still have the Valley of Vision book that you gave me for my birthday. I don't know if you remember that we went out to a burger joint, and it's been one of the best gifts I've gotten so far. So I really appreciate that.
I do remember Atomic Burger, and that was just before everything shut down with the ominous COVID virus that was coming through.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where have you landed now? Because you're not in Oxford anymore. You've headed back to the States. What are you up to?
Yeah, so I'm just starting my assistant professorship at Villanova University in the humanities department. I'm the professor of humanities and the sciences there. And it's just a match made in heaven. I love the students, the colleagues, the culture, and you get a real chance to speak into the lives of students who are asking the kinds of questions that you're raising throughout your ministry and platform here. For instance, in one of my classes, I teach a class just called God, which is pretty intimidating. It's just a class on different approaches to exploring the God and religion question. And I ask my students, hey, what's one question that you hope we'll explore together? And a lot of them will say, I don't know what to believe. And I'm like, wow, that's really interesting that you would come to a university class to decide what to believe about these really big questions. So it's a privilege and it's a thrill. It's really fun. So I'm going to be here. I think long term, it's a tenure track job. It's been a huge blessing, and I'm just really happy and grateful for it.
Oh, that's really exciting. Well, we're here to talk about some of your research that you're doing back across the pond there at Oxford in the UK. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear some of the backstory and what sparked your interest in C.S. Lewis and how that passion led you to pursue scholarly work at Oxford Uni.
Yeah, that's a great question. So like many people, I had a very personal encounter with Lewis. So I first read a Spanish translation of his Mere Christianity by total accident. Now I say that it was providence, but I was living in Guadalajara, Mexico. I just wanted to practice my Spanish reading. I went to my uncle's personal library, and he had Mero Cristianismo there. I took it out and I just started reading it just to read in Spanish. And the thoughts and the form of writing actually really captivated me and reminded me of one of my favorite games growing up, which is chess. And there was something about the structure. Lewis says this, but his interlocutor says this, and then Lewis responds this, and this back and forth movement that reminded me of chess. And that moment was really powerful for me because I felt like God was inviting me to play a game with him. And that was enough just to completely awaken my interest into these deep questions. And that was the pivotal turning point for me in my whole life, really, my intellectual life, my trajectory. It was that encounter with Lewis. And I never thought I'd go to, Oxford and study him at a doctoral level, but God opened the doors to do that. And it's just been a huge, rewarding, and a blessing, really. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity. So it started very personal, and then I realized, oh, there's some scholarship that could be done here, and that's how it worked out.
Yeah, well, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, one of your supervisors at Oxford was Alistair McGrath, is that correct?
That's correct. Alistair McGrath and Michael Ward.
Michael Ward, yeah. Well, Alistair, I recently read, a couple of years ago now, his biography, C.S. Lewis, A Life, and he makes mention in there of a long-term friend, Owen Barfield, who once remarked that there are basically three C.S. Lewises. You've got Lewis, the best-selling author of novels. You've got the lesser-known Lewis, the Christian apologist, and the lesser-known still Oxford Don and literary critic. And your research seems to bring in a fourth dimension, or perhaps a subpoint to the second lesser-known Lewis, the Christian writer, in that you're really looking at Lewis the theologian. Now, as I understand your dissertation and your DPhil, that was the first ever submitted on C.S. Lewis to the Faculty of Theology and Religion at Oxford University. Could you just tell us a little bit about why you think Lewis the theologian has been so untapped?
So this really struck me as like something I really didn't expect when my advisor told me, "Hey, do you know that you're doing the first theology dissertation from Oxford?" And I thought, "There's no way." I mean, he's been dead for about 60 years, and there were American students that were writing doctoral research on him while he was alive, so as early as in 1949. And it's just shocking that it took Oxford almost 60 years to see in him some theological potential. And there's many different reasons for this, but Lewis is very clear. And in the biography that you read, he was a reluctant convert, a reluctant theologian, right? He felt like academic professional theology had forgotten about the audience that it's intended to reach, which is the normal everyday believer. And he says, if my friend Austin Farrer, who was a professional theologian, had just written popular works, there would have been no need for C.S. Lewis, he says in one of his letters. So he felt like he was called to do this. And that led him to be disadvantaged career-wise. So Oxford never offered him a full professorship because he never studied theology and never taught theology. And yet he's writing the Screwtape Letters, The Problem of Pain, Mere Christianity, these international bestsellers, even though this was not the thing that he made his living by. So they thought that this guy can't be serious if he's writing the Screwtape Letters, The Great Divorce. So it wasn't until he went to Cambridge University in 1954 that Oxford thought, oh no, we're going to lose him. They made a counter offer, but it was too late by then. So Oxford really didn't see him as as a theological thinker worth taking seriously. And you can see in some of the testimonies of theologians that started growing up after Lewis, theologians like Alistair McGrath, N.T. Wright, Rowe, and Williams, they all share a similar theme that as they were preparing in their theological studies, Lewis was seen as someone who is embarrassingly simplistic, someone who doesn't offer robust insights into really complicated questions. And if you also track how Lewis is described in different encyclopedias of theology in the following decades, he's almost never listed, even in evangelical encyclopedias, he's almost never listed as a theologian, right? He's listed as a student of literature, as a literary writer, but not really as a theologian. And I think what Alistair McGrath has shown is that it's not really up to you completely whether you're described as something. It's up to communities that accept you and receive you as an insight, as a voice, as a trustworthy guide. And McGrath just makes a really good argument that hundreds of the thousands of Christians all over the world have seen something worth taking seriously in Lewis's theological writings, and that by any definition, we should count him among the theologians or theological thinkers that we can take seriously, even at the graduate level.
That's really interesting. I mean, there's a bigger conversation there about identity formation, isn't there, in terms of communal kind of acceptance and recognition and so on. But if I'm hearing you correctly, it sounds like because of Lewis's burden for communicating certain ideas in a certain way, he basically sacrificed, reputation, and I guess possibility in the academic world. Because of this burden that he saw to communicate, big ideas to the masses, which really is its own form of, I guess, intelligence. In that, you've got different kinds of academics: those who reach out and push the envelope in creating new ideas, who often find it very challenging to communicate those down. But then you've got those great synthesizers of ideas who do have that unique gifting and calling. And it sounds like Lewis is probably in that space. But even then, his work, the lesser known work of Lewis, the literary critic, very much was steeped in academia, wasn't it?
Yeah, and let me just make a comparison quickly, and not just because you're interviewing me, but you come from a background where you were doing really well off, right? You were in I believe, in the engineering field, and you felt like God was calling you to a specific kind of ministry. And even though you were gonna give up certain benefits or professional advancement, you felt like this is what God is calling you to do. Lewis did the same thing, right? It cost him promotions. He did not like teaching undergraduates. He just hated it. And yet he had to do it for so long because they didn't promote him to a full professorship. But he felt that I'd rather be doing what God is calling me to do than do something for my own advancement, even if but it's not perfectly aligned with what God's calling him to do. So I really admire that. It gives me kind of courage when I start thinking about different possibilities in the future. But anybody that feels like God is calling them to do something, even though it's going to cost them professional advancement or even income, Lewis is someone that you can look up to as an example for that.
I appreciate that, and I'm encouraged by that. And let me speak personally, there is nowhere I'd rather be. I get to speak to a friend who studied Lewis about Narnia, and this is my job. So here we are. Well, let's try and communicate some of these big ideas in very Lewis style then down to those that are listening, and try and unpack a little bit here on your dissertation. Now, the title of your dissertation, hopefully I pronounce this right, Love is Tears, the Carmolipic Theological Vision of C.S. Lewis. Can you explain what that means and perhaps just give a very brief overview of the abstract?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is the title of my dissertation that I completed at Oxford. I'm working on making it a monograph, so everybody can read it. So I'd appreciate prayers on that. But the title is "Love is Tears," which is the title of one of Lewis's poems. He was a poet, an aspiring poet for about the first 25 years of his life, until he finally kind of said, "Okay, I'm not going to be a poet." But he always kept that poetic insight, and he wrote a poem where he starts describing love, and it says, "Love is as hard as nails, it's as fierce as fire," and one of the lines is, "Love is tears," right? And the thing about tears is that you can cry from sorrow and from joy. And I thought it was a very powerful image to capture what I'm trying to express in the dissertation, which is reference in this word. It's a very strange word, but it's carmolipic, right? Or carmolipi. This is a Greek word. that many Christian mystics were using, especially in the 7th century with Saint John Climacus, who was one of the mystical fathers. But in his book Ladder of Divine Ascent, you find this word carmolipi or carmolipic, and it basically means joyful sorrow or sorrowful joy. It adds the two words, one meaning joy, one meaning sorrow. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting and rich concept. Not just joy and not just sorrow, but their unification into something else, some like a third thing. And basically, the whole dissertation is arguing that this is a really appropriate and rich way to describe C.S. Lewis's theology, his imagination, his vision, that each element synthesizes these two different poles, right? The joyful pole and the sorrowful pole. And I think it's very easy to let go of one or the other, and maybe we could discuss this further. But what I really appreciate about Lewis is that he managed to hold these two in tension, he managed to synthesize them. And I think that's really important, especially at a time like this.
Yeah, absolutely. They shall sow in tears, shall reap in joy, Proverbs 14.
Amen.
And I'm just curious, does one come to Oxford University with an awareness of sorrow and joy in the writings of Lewis, and that's what I'm going to write on? Like, what was the impetus or the catalyst for this particular area in your pursuit? Was it something that you stumbled upon while at Oxford, or where did it come about?
Absolutely. This is such a great question. My original proposal was just focusing on Lewis and laughter and humor. And that's what I got accepted with. That's what they allowed me to start with. And I did about 2 years of research focusing exclusively on what is Lewis doing with humor, with rhetorical laughter in his writings. And it wasn't until about, like a year and a half, 2 years in that I had a discussion with Michael Ward, my supervisor, and he said, I think you're only getting half the picture. Like, yeah, there's laughter and levity, but there's also gravity and sorrow and loss. Wouldn't it be interesting to look at both of these things at the same time? And that just fit perfectly my interest and the way that the research was going. So it developed. That was a big shift that the research took. And I think if you talk to any doctoral student, they go in with one idea and it's never usually the original idea, right? It's always taking twists and turns. But at the end, you look at it and you say, yeah, I think it's better off having developed in that way. So it was definitely a development at Oxford. And I have a lot to thank Michael Ward for his insight.
Yeah, and Michael Ward, for anyone listening, he has done some fascinating work on the planetary, I guess, symbolism behind the Narnia Chronicles. I'll just leave that one to you and Google to check out, but that's super, super interesting. I remember shaking his hand at the Kilns, of all places, as you and I were there actually listening to the late Walter Hooper, the last editor of C.S. Lewis, give a reading there. So that was a really special evening. Okay, let's get into some of the specifics here then of your dissertation. So I'm keen to just try and walk through the basic flow as I see it, and you can correct me if I'm pushing you in the wrong direction here. But you begin your discussion of this dilemma in Christian thought, where Christianity is sometimes criticized on the one hand for insufficiently engaging with the tragic aspects of life, while on the other hand seems to fail at fully affirming the joyful aspects of life. And you observe how these accusations of both escapism from the tragedy and joylessness in, I guess, the ordinary everyday of life presents two kind of dilemmas and opposing criticisms. Can you just unpack those accusations and whether or not you think they actually have a basis and are valid and fair enough as they relate to Christianity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So on one side, you have critics like Marx, Freud, James Baldwin, among many others that think Christianity is a form of escapism. Right? Think about Freud. Right? That you're constantly escaping from tragic elements that you're not grown up to face. You're not prepared to face head on. So we just invent this thing called God, this realm called heaven, and it's constantly distracting us so that we don't really have to reckon with suffering and oppression concretely. So on the one hand, you have a bunch of critics that are making that similar claim philosophically, theologically, literarily. But then on the other hand, you have people like Nietzsche, David Hume, Milan Kundera, the Czech writer, uh, that are expressing something that can be captured in one of Charles Swinburne's line in his poem Hymn to Persephone. And he says this really fascinating claim. He says, "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown gray from thy breath." I'll just repeat that again. "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean, the world has grown gray from thy breath." And he's basically lamenting. He's saying the world used to be so colorful, so much fun, so much joy when the pagan gods reigned. Now that this pale Galilean, Jesus, came to power, everything's grown gray and dull and boring. And I found that this idea tracks well with how many people tend to feel about the Christian faith, that it requires a kind of tolerance for boredom. Like, why would anybody want to go to church on a Sunday morning, reciting these prayers, reading this boring book, the Bible, right? And I found that, oh, not only is this an argument that academics are making, but it also has some cultural purchase. The idea that, hey, if you want to be happy, don't become a Christian, right? And this was part of what Nietzsche's point in naming atheism the Frohlich Wissenschaft, right? The happy, joyful, frolicking science, right? The gay science, right? If you want to be happy, become become your own god, sort of. Don't follow established religion. So I found that there was these two criticisms of Christianity that are being made almost in the opposite direction. And I think that there's something to them. So in my work, I want to say, sure, there are forms of Christianity, there are forms of Christian thinking that lend themselves to this, that lend themselves to these criticisms, right? On the one hand, you have you have these kinds of trends, right? You have what's called resurrectionism. This is a term that Douglas John Hall coined, and it just basically means that the resurrection cancels out the crucifixion. This is very influential in my Pentecostal upbringing, right, where everything is about power and Christ as the victor. The idea being that the resurrection canceled all the tragic elements of the cross, right? So we don't really have to worry about the cross too much, about crucifixion, about the horrible death that Jesus went through. That was just kind of a means to this greater end, which is glory and redemption and sanctification. And so I want to say that certainly there are ways of thinking about that. There are ways of thinking about the theological virtue of hope that can be very escapist as well. Like, if we think that hope is just optimism, is just buoyancy, is just you have to be cheerful all the time, that can be a form of denying the reality and gravity of suffering. So this is what I want to say. These criticisms are not baseless, right? We have to give them their respect. We have to recognize when they're accurate. But I want to say we should see that as a challenge. We should try to live out our Christian faith. We should try to live out our theological thinking in ways that protect from these criticisms. So I take them almost as cautionary tales, as ways of doing theology better.
Yeah, I can attest to that in my own life and from my own experience in terms of the bases to some of these, and I think it is a point to reflect on just what it is we believe and the way that does affect how we live in the here and the now. I'd like to press. Well, look, there's a question that I've had that I've been bugging to ask a C.S. Lewis scholar for some time, and I've got one now. So here it is. The issue of theodicism, which is one of the points that you raise in terms of a theodicy basically not engaging seriously with the tragedy of life. It's this theory of how an all-loving, all-powerful, all-good God would allow suffering. And so some people would say that the theories that Christians put forward over the centuries or millennia have just been too detached from the gritty grind of reality. And it's interesting in the life of C.S. Lewis himself, because he writes in 1940 an excellent work on the problem of pain that really treats this question of pain and suffering in life. So, that's World War II era, as an object of study that he has piercing insights into. But then 20 years later, it's not an object of thought for him. He loses his wife and he's now subject to pain and suffering. And he pens that little book, A Grief Observed, under a pseudonym, N.W. Clerk. And it strikes me that here you have the problem of pain, theoretical and philosophical. It's examined from a distance. A Grief Observed, deeply personal, and it's visceral. And you would read that and not know what this guy thinks about God, other than he's disappointed at the door slammed in his face and the sound of bolting and double bolting from the inside, and then silence, to quote Lewis. Is that an example, would you say, of the way that even in the writings of Lewis we have both a treatment of the visceral and the theoretical problem of pain in one that's trying to keep the balance of both, even if that was an unintentional outcome?
That is a very astute question. I think that the general division maps on somewhat well.
Mm-hmm.
A Grief Observed being very subjective. He never intended to publish it. In fact, there was his friends that pushed him to publish it. But he believed from a young age, actually, that writing for him was a way of coping with very difficult times in his life. And you can see the similar. So in Surprised by Joy, he says that at the end when he's converting, that whenever he lifted his mind from his work is when he felt the steady, unrelenting approach of him who he so earnestly desired not to meet, being God, right? So even then you can see that, he's trying to hold something at bay by writing, right? That it's the same dynamic when he loses his wife, right? He's trying to hold at bay the crippling grief and anxiety and fear by trying to process it and writing. So it's a very subjective work. The problem of pain is a philosophical work, it's a theological work. But what I admire about it is that he also tries to engage himself subjectively. So he says things like this. Oh, you wonder what I'm like when I'm facing real suffering. He says, easy, I'll tell you, I am a great coward. He says, I'm a great coward. And he starts to describe even these images that he experienced in World War One, where he fought in the front lines of France, and he starts to experience these bodies that are crushed like beetles, and he has these very vivid metaphors, and he's trying to explore the subject not just intellectually but imaginatively as well. So I think you're tracking onto something, that there is clearly a difference in these two different approaches to the topic. But I'd want to say also that there are some subjective elements that are really interesting in the problem of pain that you wouldn't find in many, not all, but many contemporary analytic approaches to the subject, right? So you wouldn't find that kind of subjectivity, I think, in someone like Plantinga or Richard Swinburne, right? But you see it in someone like Lewis, where he says, listen, I'm trying to be sensitive. I'm trying to get myself personally involved in this discussion. But most importantly, he said, my priority is not alienating anyone from the truth, right? Not alienating anyone from the truth. Another way of thinking about it, and this is the last thing I'll say, and I'd love to know what you think, is you can see that in the problem of pain, he's trying to get at truth, and meaning is kind of secondary, where in A Grief Observed, meaning's primary, right? He's trying to say, well, what does suffering mean when you're in it, right? And then the rays of truth are almost, they come in towards the end. How does that track for you, David? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking here of, I think, another influence behind Lewis, and that is MacDonald. So he's got that essay on truth where he talks about, and I'm going to paraphrase, I don't have it off my head. He talks about the truth of a flower. You can cut it up, put it underneath a microscope and analyze it, or you could pick it up and smell it. And so it strikes me that in A Grief Observed, it's an embodied appreciation of the subject he's writing about, in contrast to the more objective thought in the problem of pain. Although, as you say, it sounds like there are some subjective dimensions which I'd like to go back and double check. So both are true. It's just kind of in different modes, or modes of being, to be a little bit abstract. So yeah, and which one's more true or less true? I don't think that's the right question. Really, it's an appreciation of it from different angles, and both of them together complement the totality of what we understand to be the true, the good, and the beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better myself. That's great. Different perspectival approaches to the same thing.
Which that was an unintended, segue to what we're talking about here, because when it comes to this dilemma, we're talking about different perspectives, aren't we? Ultimately, of the same thing, and it was really interesting as I was considering your dissertation on the joylessness. Which, so if the tragedy angle is more of a doctrinal criticism of Christianity, then on the joylessness, that's more of a historical criticism in that, Nietzsche and others, as you said, Christianity is boring. Why go to church on a Sunday? But I was really fascinated by the insights you shared from Lewis about his view on laughter and the humor that he saw in some of the Gospels. I had never thought, for example, the idea that Jesus pointing out the obvious, healthy people don't need doctors, could be seen as humor. I'm not sure if you've watched Dallas Jenkins' The Chosen, but I think in that, he's playing in the spaces of silence really well in this art that is an embellishment of the Gospels. But he seems to have done something that really resonates with the audience today, and that is feeding into the laughter of Jesus, his smile, his interaction with the children. Um, and we do see traces of this in the Gospels as well. Luke 7, he's accused of being too joyful when hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. So that was a refreshing other angle to all of this from the Gospels that I'd never considered before.
Yeah, I think this the criticism's really powerful, and I argue that Nietzsche is the one that philosophically confronts us with what's at stake if we ignore levity and laughter as a theologically appropriate mode of thinking about God. Some other philosophers have picked up on this, that God, James Martin wrote this book Between Heaven and Mirth, and he starts off by saying that they were at a mass once, and one of his fellow priests couldn't stop laughing during the mass, right? And then the elder of the entire community chastises him for excessive levity. And then the priest tries to defend himself and says, "No, I don't think it was excessive." And the director says, "All levity is excessive. All levity is excessive." And there's something really interesting about that, where it's like, whoa, where is the place of levity in my relationship with God, right? When I pray, I'm very serious. When we're at church, we're supposed to be serious, occasionally laugh at the pastor's jokes, but it seems like levity is a very secondary thing. And yet we talk about joy being very central. And I think part of what Nietzsche confronts us with is what happens when we divorce joy from physical expressions of levity. Um, so it's trying to kind of reunite these two things and saying, hey, levity is okay. We can counterbalance it with appropriate gravity. But so far, gravity, being serious, being appropriate, being decorous, has kind of led the way in how Christians, I think, especially after the 20th century. So there's a whole movement after the Holocaust, the Shoah, where people think, no, how could we possibly enjoy life? How could we possibly laugh when there's so much tragedy, so much oppression, so much carnage in the world? So we need to actually double down on tragedy and seriousness because this is the appropriate ethical response to such a broken world. Now there was a counter attack to that with people like Harvey Cox, who tried to revive this idea of the feast of, um, the feast of fools. There's also the feast of the ass, right? There's so many different, like almost liturgical expressions of levity and embodied laughter. So there was a counter wave of people saying, no, no, no. Actually, if we look and read closely into the scriptures, into tradition, we see holy folly, the tradition of the sacred fool. We see Jesus pointing out, as what you said, being kind of ironic and subversive, different ways of reinterpreting the tradition. So there's like the tragic wave and then the comic reaction. And I'm trying to say Lewis keeps the course, right? He kind of unites both of these approaches. And I think that that's really important to kind of avoid extremes.
Yeah, and I mean, so classically speaking, Horns of Dilemma, they're kind of a lose-lose situation where either side gets skewered by the different problems. But as I look at Jesus in the Gospels, he is the master of escaping the horns of dilemma, usually by asking questions that expose the assumptions underneath. And what I appreciate about Lewis and what you've exposed here is how he doesn't see that the horns of dilemma, in this case with these opposed criticisms of Christianity, as something to be afraid of. In fact, it's an opportunity. He would see it as a positive sign towards the fact that perhaps Christianity is a bigger vision of something. It's more full-orbed, and he just basically doesn't get skewered left or right. He just kind of headbutts the bull, so to speak. And so we've talked now about these attending dilemmas and their criticisms. When you think about it, it's trying to break apart the cohesion of the Christian worldview or vision. And having seen how Lewis isn't, taken aback by that, but sees it as a positive sign, the way he integrates the sorrow and the joy into this tragicomic vision that's expressed across life and literature and theology, to unpack that a little bit more, this idea of the vision, which is the intentional phrase there in your dissertation title, I just want to take you and the audience to a scene in one of my favorite Narnia Chronicles, The Silver Chair. And I just want to read this out to try and paint the picture and then get your view on how this relates to that vision. So this is the Silver Chair. Basically, Puddleglum is traveling and he's held captive underground with the Green Witch, who's trying to enchant and manipulate him and his companions into believing that the world above, with the sun and the tree and the skies, it just doesn't exist. All there is this underland. In other words, she's trying to limit his vision of reality. Now, there are echoes of Plato here that I'd love to pull apart with you in a moment. But I just want to read this excerpt to you and then get your feedback on it. So Puddleglum says to the witch, "Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things, trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I can say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones. Suppose this black pit of a kingdom of yours is the only world. Well, it strikes me as a pretty poor one. And that's a funny thing when you think of it. We're just babies making up a game, if you're right, but 4 babies playing a game that can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live like a Narnian, even if there isn't any Narnia." So, despite his suffering in the underworld, a symbol of tragedy, Puddleglum holds to this vision of Narnia, which we could see as a symbol of hope and joy, that the comedy dimension here. Does that scene reflect what you're getting at in terms of Lewis' tragi-comedic vision, where joy and sorrow are not opposed, but intertwined in a way that gives a deeper meaning to both?
That's a great question. I think it does reflect the category of tragicomic or carmelipic, as I mentioned earlier. And this reflects Lewis's own journey. So he says in Surprised by Joy that he came to a point where he felt split between what his reason was telling him, which was his grim facts, but what the picture that his desire painted, which he said was like a mini island, a myth. It was a garden, it was beautiful, but it wasn't true. So part of what Lewis found in the Christian vision is the unification of truth with meaning and beauty. And he's trying to say that there's something fundamental, that human beings are not just calculators, we're not just equation solvers and finders, that we're not just after the truth, as important as that is. We're also meaning seeking and beauty seeking beings, right? So they're stuck in Underland. It's a grim world. There's just grim facts. There's suffering. It's a tragic landscape. And yet Puddleglum says, wait a second. If all I was satisfied was with the grim facts, then sure, I could be comfortable down here. I could be comfortable relegating myself, reducing myself to an actor in a tragic play. But in reality, there's more to the picture, right? You can't just silence desire for meaning and beauty. And that's what he finds in the image of Aslan, right? Which is a representative, a kind of allegorical, not allegorical, the proper term is a supposal, right, of Jesus. Like, what would Jesus look like if he lived in this world of animals called Narnia, right? Well, it would probably look like Aslan. So Puddleglum says, I'm going to be on Aslan's side. I'm going to live like a Narnian, even if there isn't any Narnia, even if there isn't any Aslan, because that is way more meaningful and way more beautiful than this one-dimensional, reductive, grim, tragic world that the Queen is offering them. So I think it reflects not just Lewis's own journey, but this very important insight that we're not just truth seekers, we're beauty seekers, we're meaning seekers. And in the Christian vision, all these three things come together. Let me zoom in just a little bit closer. Eustace says in The Silver Chair that Puddleglum is always expecting the worst, so he's a pessimist, but he's always wrong. Right? He's always wrong. And Puddleglum is the funniest character in the whole story, right? Because he really is expecting the worst. He thinks he's going to get eaten. He thinks he's going to get crushed by rocks. He thinks, oh, any moment it's going to be over. We're all going to die, and he's wrong every time. And part of what Lewis is trying to critique there, I believe, is this tendency that he saw that the tragic vision of life is somehow the truest vision, right? That being pessimistic is the only appropriate response to the world. He's trying to not just expose that as false, like it's not true, like life isn't always as bad as the pessimist says, as the tragedian says. But at the same time, he's trying to ridicule it and say, actually, if you see this work out in the real world, it's just kind of ridiculous. There's a comedy to it, right? There's a comedy to, um, experiencing true joy, and then just thinking, oh, this isn't real, right? This isn't real. It's saying, oh, I'm sure it's going to get worse. Oh, I'm sure life can always get worse. Lewis is trying to say that's kind of a ridiculous. It's kind of a ridiculous way to live. That life transcends both optimism and pessimism, tragedy and comedy. That it's a third thing. That it unites both of them in this very rich and real way. And one of the terms that I use in my work is tragicomic realism or Carmellipic realism, right? It's being real about both the sorrow and the joy, and not reducing one or elevating one over the other, but saying they're both equally real and they're both trying to tell us something really important about not just God, but the nature of reality itself. Is that tracking with you, David?
Yeah, that's absolutely tracking with me, because that phrase realism, before I even encountered it in your dissertation, is what struck me. The realism of the Christian story, in that it's big enough to encompass the full range of human experiences and joy and sorrow amidst life and death. And to speak personally here, just to riff off this picture or this scene from The Silver Chair and Plato's Cave, as I think about that, Plato's Cave, for anyone who's not aware, is basically this picture where there are people down under the ground, chained in a cave. They're only able to see shadows on a wall that are cast by a fire behind them. Those shadows, that's it. That's the totality of their vision of reality. But then one of these prisoners is freed. They follow the path up to the surface of the earth, to the outside world, the upper land, where they step into the atmosphere for the first time, and they're blinded by the overwhelming brilliance of the light of the sun, and with their eyes starting to adjust, their senses, their smells, everything coming to them for the first time. They're experiencing the world in its fullness. Speaking personally, that is the emotional shock impact of this fuller vision of reality with the sun and the shadows, in what Christianity has provided for me time and time and time again. And it just, every time that happens, it's just a further reinforcing of this bigger embodied vision of truth that we were talking about earlier. It's like Christianity for me is like stepping into the wardrobe, not into the fantasy, but into the reality, ironically, of the totality of what truth is. And so when I'm asked questions by people like, David, what would it take for you to reject Christianity? It's like, I want to ask, do you understand what you're asking? You're asking me to crawl back into a cave and chain myself to the contentment of shadows. Now, people might say, but that's just the truth, David. And while I would reject that and argue against it, I think it was Chesterton who said, if the cosmos of the material is the real cosmos, then it's not much. It's shrunk. I'll just say, with my mate Puddleglum that I'm going to stand by the play world, and I don't mean that in a fanciful, fictitious sense. I mean that in the sense that it actually is big enough to take the total, encompass all of the lived experiences of the human condition. Yeah.
I think this is part of what something that I've been thinking about recently is Pascal's wager, and I think it's a lot more robust than it gets credit for. Actually, the wager being, if you're not certain of anything, right? You're just like placing bets almost in a casino, right? You're playing a game. You have to place a bet. Well, what's the best bet to make? And he goes through the probabilistic, argument and says, look, even if there is no God, even if the percentage of there being a God is just like 1%, right? The smartest bet to make is still to believe, right? But he also, people think that's just an intellectual argument. He also applies it to the question of what is the good life, right? Like even if we don't know, even if it's highly probable that we're wrong, the best bet to make is to live as if God were real, as if the good life were pursuing God, pursuing virtue, pursuing wisdom, truth, goodness, and beauty, right? And you start to see similar logic with Puddleglum, where he says, look, let's suppose, which isn't a great supposal, but let's suppose it wasn't true. Are you realizing what you're asking me to reject, right, David? Like what you said, like there's so much beauty, there's so much truth, there's so much goodness. Even if it were not true, it still kind of wins on other grounds almost. I mean, that's a different way of putting it. I do believe that truth is really important, but at the same time, we have to see like there's so much more, right? There's a goodness, there's beauty, there's a meaning, and part of what the Christian vision gives is a unity of these things, which is so precious and unique that it's really hard to turn down once you see it clearly.
Yeah, and obviously this connects as well, this bigger vision of the natural and the supernatural connects in as well to Lewis's argument from desire. Do you want to just quickly sketch that one out for us and how that relates to this bigger vision?
So the argument from desire runs something like this. Every natural desire that human beings have has some form of fulfillment, right? So we're talking about purely natural desires. We're not talking about desires that we've learned over time or through technology or through, fiction or fantasy. We're talking about purely natural desires, like our desire for like food, right? Our desire for water, our desire for reproduction, for sex, right? He says, wouldn't it be really weird if we've had this desire for food, but it didn't exist? Like, what? That would be really strange, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be weird if you were thirsty, but there was no such thing as water or liquids, right? Wouldn't it be strange if you felt sexual appetite, sexual hunger, but there was no such thing as sex, right? Wouldn't that be really strange? So he tries to say, look, don't you find in yourself a kind of desire for capital J joy, right? For like perfect kind of joy, perfect happiness, right? Um, wouldn't it be weird? Like, how do you explain this desire that we have that every single human being has? Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to achieve it. You could not, right? He says you could die in the desert from lack of food or lack of water. But it does give us a very strong hint and suggestion that we come from that kind of world where these things actually exist. And famously, he says in Christianity, if I find in myself a desire that no natural thing can satisfy, nothing in this world can satisfy, the most likely explanation is that I was made for another world, right? Now, this is not a deductive argument, but it's trying to say pay attention to the clues, right? Pay attention. When you try to find satisfaction, it always is temporary, it always fails. Why are we unsatisfied with that? Like, where did this idea come from that there's something more? And he says, well, maybe we are made for a world in which there is more, in which there is more meaning, more beauty. Maybe that other world is with God. It's something like that.
Desire is a signpost to this bigger vision of reality. As mentioned at the outset, so Lewis is not necessarily notable for being a theologian per se, although I guess we're pushing against that now with the contribution that you've made to the academy. But I think, frankly, you've done an outstanding job of demonstrating that he wasn't just a literary critic or popular apologist, but had some deep theological reflections to offer the world. And given this, I just want to bring this now to the central person of the Christian faith, and that is Jesus Christ. How do you see this tragic comedic vision relating to him? Because it strikes me that what we find in the events of his life and death, tragedy and resurrection, comedy, is just speaking right to this fuller embodied vision that you've been researching and writing about. Can you just elaborate on that in terms of how it's embodied in the passion of Christ himself?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I have to go back to his friend Tolkien, who was very important in actually leading Lewis to converting to Christianity, to reconverting to Christianity. So Tolkien described the gospel with this phrase called eucatastrophe, which is the good catastrophe, the good downturn, etymologically. And he tries to depict this in several moments of The Lord of the Rings, where it's like beyond all hope. Like tragedy is imminent. You've lost, there's scars, there's blood, there's death. And yet there's like a glimmer of intense, poignant hope and joy that comes through, right? Um, it's this image of, for instance, I mean, there's different moments where the catastrophe can come in, but one that has struck with me is if you read Lord of the Rings, and I highly recommend it. It's a very thick book. It's the kind of thing you can brag about, a humble brag about around certain people. But I highly recommend if you haven't tackled it yet, it's a reward. It's a rewarding reading. But after Frodo and Sam, they destroy the ring. Spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read it yet, right? I was thinking it's over. It's over, right? They won. Good won. Um, evil lost, right? Tolkien shows us a much more complicated ending where the tragedy remains. There's scars that remain. There's separation between Frodo and his friends, but it's also mixed with a kind of victory, right? So Lewis inherited this view of eucatastrophe, and he felt like the gospel is something that you can't just reduce to either the crucifixion or the resurrection. You have to hold them both together. It's a good catastrophe that Christ was incarnate, that he lived his life, and that he gave his life for us, and that he resurrected, right? This is a good catastrophe. And just to zoom in a little bit closer through this lens of tragicomedy or Carmolopai, there's this view that in order for God to become man in Jesus Christ, he had to empty himself of certain divine attributes, right? This is called the doctrine of kenosis, right? Where he had to empty himself of uh, different kind of attributes like omniscience, being there's certain divine attributes that Christ had to like almost leave in heaven, right? Suspend to become limited to a particular body in a particular time and place. Well, what's fascinating about tragedy, classically conceived, is that it requires a kind of condescension. So it's this kind of fall. So it starts with an elevated figure. Think about Oedipus, for instance. In Oedipus Rex, he starts as a king, right? He's the king. Through a series of developments, he figures out who he really is, that he murdered his father, that his wife is actually his mother. It's really tragic. But the tragedies end with a dissension, right? With a kind of fall. That's very similar to what's going on in the kenosis, right? For in order for God to become a specific human being limited by time and space, a kind of being that feels hunger, that all these different natural qualities, right? He had to give up some divine attributes. It's a kind of condescension, really, which is a tragic motif, and it's always headed towards the crucifixion, right? Like his life is just one sign. Okay, I've come here for this event. I'm not just going to live and redeem life itself, redeem different experiences, but it's culminating in a specific event, which is the crucifixion. So there's this shadow of death and defeat and tragedy and shame, but at the same time, there's this motif of reunification and unity and love, right? The reason why Christ had to come into the picture is to unite us to God. And I don't know if you've noticed, but many comedies end with some sort of wedding, with some sort of reunification of lovers, of life. And this blew me away when I started studying it, that even now, comedies on Netflix or romantic comedies, um, this would have been a like, of course comedies are romantic, that's how they end, right? If you look at Shakespearean comedies, it's the lovers reuniting, coming together, there's a new life coming into the picture. So both of these two comic qualities, reunification with a lover and the production of new life coming into the picture, we see that in the gospel as well. That the whole reason why Christ came to redeem us is to reunite us with our beloved, which is God, and to introduce a new kind of life, a new kind of generation into the picture. So even thought of as classically, which is the view that Lewis would have ascribed to, there are these kind of literary staples of tragedy and comedy that are interwoven in the gospel story.
And what's interesting there is that this isn't just a Western philosophical angle to take, because obviously the wedding of the Lamb in the New Testament, the great finale there, is steeped in Jewish, Eastern, Middle Eastern, ancient Near Eastern ideas of weddings and the process thereof and all of the rest. So again, it speaks to this bigger vision that is for all humanity, not any particular cultural East-West divide. But look, as I've thought about Love is Tears and the cross, as you've just beautifully laid it out there, it just reflects that on a personal level. It just reflects that love so often involves suffering, precisely because it's for the beloved. Yet in the case of the passion, it's that very suffering that deepens and enriches our ultimate joy in the resurrection. I mean, in order for that, the very idea of a resurrection itself presupposes a death. So it's precisely through the sorrow that the joy comes. It's precisely because love is tears that the Christian hope is that one day we shall arrive upon shores where there are no more tears. And I think Tolkien, for his part at the end of The Lord of the Rings, really does capture that in a striking way. Look, I'm thankful for your time here. I want to try and draw this to a close. I guess as I've been thinking through this in terms of the so what factor for believers and non-believers alike. So at Questioning Christianity, our focus is on connecting the Christian story to life's deepest questions. So there is that narrative arc, so to speak, that we're thinking through here in terms of how to apply all of these big questions of life to what the Christian story has to share. So building on your research here then, particularly Lewis's use of imagination and desire in these signposts to help invoke an awareness of the greater realities of joy and sorrow, how do you think that can help the church today in our evangelistic efforts of communicating the gospel? Is there a need for a more imaginative apologetic approach in our current cultural context?
I think that there is. That's another great question. Let me start with a saying that I like that the theologian Kevin J. Van Hooser said. He said, human beings are not just storytellers, we're story dwellers, right? We live and have our being in stories, right? In kinds of narratives. So a lot of apologetics and evangelism has focused mostly on arguments, right? Communicating arguments, trying to persuade people of the truth of Christianity, which is very important and I think fundamental. But we also want to pay attention to what is the story that we're inviting people to dwell in. And it's our task as communicators to show that the Christian story is just a richer, more beautiful, truer story than the options that are out there. And I'm open. It's important to be open. I'm open to being shown a different story. I'm open to being proven wrong and saying, wow, But really, when I look at the different options on the table, naturalism, different religions, atheism, right? I don't find this kind of story that mixes perfectly, that keeps in balance truth, beauty, meaning, right? And I think that's really important that people are starving for a kind of meaning to know that they matter. So, for instance, the movie, the movie Deadpool and Wolverine came out, which I'm sure Christians will have very different perspectives on. It's a very vulgar movie, but very interestingly, Deadpool has a crisis of meaning, right? And he says, "I just want to matter, right? I just want to matter," and that's kind of the motivation of the entire film. But it's speaking to this wider cultural moment where human beings, especially with the rise of AI, especially with social media, how do I know that I matter? Right? How do I know that my life matters? How do I know that my life has meaning? And I think the beautiful thing of the Christian gospel is that it's the kind of story that can give your life meaning, right? That can give your life beauty and truth. And I think that that's really important to take a holistic approach, that it's not just about the persuasive arguments. It's about, what do these arguments mean? What picture of reality are they pointing towards? And I think that's the takeaway that I would have from this.
Yeah, and it was Charles Taylor, I think, who used the language of disenchantment and disillusionment, and I think that is what somebody like a Lewis really has to offer. He captured the imagination of a generation with the Chronicles of Narnia, Tolkien as well, and I think if we can be pursuing creative ends like that, I mean, there's a world out there competing for our affections and our attentions, and a lot of I should invite you back so we can talk about the relationship between truth, goodness, and beauty sometime, because there are a lot of things out there that are projected as beautiful that are actually not truly beautiful, and yet they're winning the attention and affection of a whole generation today. So how the church can be focused in showing, the truth, goodness, and beauty of the gospel, that would be a very interesting conversation to have in another forum. But Jahdiel, thank you so much for your time here. I'm appreciative of the work you've done. It's definitely enhanced my vision of my own life, but also the literary work of Lewis. There's something now, like Michael Ward's work on the planetary symbolism. Now, when I'm reading Lewis, I can't help but see the tragedy and sorrow motif threaded throughout his various works. So I'm going to keep an eye out for that. What are you working on at the moment? And is there any upcoming projects that are ongoing for you right now?
Yeah, first of all, let me just say I appreciate this invitation. I appreciate you taking the time to read my research and work, because you write it just for 2 examiners, right? And you're lucky if 3 or 4 people read it. But knowing that there's interest out there, it just means the world to me. So I just want to thank you for that. Currently, I'm taking a year pausing my C.S. Lewis research because I got this grant from the John Templeton Foundation through the University of Birmingham to look into the psychology of religion, and I'm trying to analyze the Theodicy debate through a psychological lens. So, as some of you may know, there's kind of 2 camps that are. It's not really camps, actually. There's just a tidal wave of interest in a movement called anti-theodicism, which is the view that we shouldn't do theodicy anymore. We shouldn't try to answer the problem of evil. We should just admit that it has no answer and kind of move on and reformulate our ideas about God. And my project is looking at, well, what are the empirical claims that they're making about human psychology, and what does the evidence say? And my argument is something like, actually, human beings psychologically need meaning and need detachment from suffering in order to cope better with it. And that's what theodicy tries to provide, is meaning for suffering and a kind of detachment from these kinds of experiences. So yeah, I'm taking this year to do that. I'm on track, and I'll be publishing on that hopefully early next year. But then next year is returning to C.S. Lewis scholarship and publishing my dissertation as a monograph. So just keep your eyes out, and I will let you all know when that comes out.
That's very exciting. We'll be looking forward to reading both of those, and we'll have to just get you back to get an update on this latest project. Dr. Jahdiel Perez, thank you so much for your time, mate. And again, really appreciate all of the hard work that you've put into this. And it's just so exciting to see you all these years later down the track now as you're pursuing a career from that time that you and I first met there at Oxford. So,
No, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for this invitation. Talking through these ideas helps me understand them even better. So I really appreciate this opportunity, and more power to you, and I wish you the best with the ministry and the podcast.
Thanks, mate. May God bless you and the family.
Likewise. And I hope to be back with you too.